All right. Well, I want to start today with some reading, and I want to talk about outlining. And so everybody on this call has has worked on this kind of outline before, but I find it just challenges me every single time. Is do you guys have we talked about This American Life,
Hmm.
the radio show? Um, the so Alex Bloomberg was one of the reporters for This American Life. He ended up founding Gimlet, which has a bunch of radio shows. But he said that whenever he would and uh, pitch a podcast idea to Ira Glass, who founded This American Life, the question that Ira would always ask is, "What's interesting about this?" And man, I find that is always the question that we have to ask. Otherwise, we turn in boring crap.
100%.
What's interesting about this? And I mean, that is the question for the copywriter, because so much that we're given is boring by nature. Um, or it takes a great deal of empathy to find what's interesting about it. Um, and so that's what I want to talk about today is what's interesting about this. Um, so, and most of us on this call have seen this article before, but I wanted to go through it again and talk about how the writer might have outlined it. I actually know this writer casually, and he recommended the the book Writing for Story, which we're gonna discuss that technique a bit. Um, so he outlined this the way that they talk about outlining and writing for story. So what I'm going to do is I want to read it. I want to discuss the 5 point outline and then go back and see if we can figure out what his outline was. So title is this for Atlanta Magazine, Dixie Speedway, Woodstock, 31 miles northwest of Atlanta. This is for a series called 1 Square Mile that they do for Atlanta Magazine. In the pits, 73-year-old Nancy Rowland, poker visor down and a Marlboro light dangling from her lips, pushes an ice scraper across the hood of the race car, sweeping off chunks of orange clay. 13-year-old Will Rowland steps out from behind the trailer, zipping up his black and red fire suit. He slips on his helmet and climbs behind the wheel of the number 22 Rowland tire crate plate model. The engine roars to life, 400 horsepower rattling 2,300 pounds of car and 95 pounds of driver. That's a great line. Mark Rowland, Will's father and crew chief, leans in to shout a few words of advice before sending his son onto the oval alongside men twice and even 3 times his age. Will raced quarter midgets, essentially souped up go-karts, from age 5, but this was his first full year in late model on the dirt wheel where speeds approach 100 miles per hour. As the cars rev their engine for the qualifier, the PA booms, wheel to wheel, hub to hub, doorpost to doorpost. Here we go. Will pulls away early, but he falters on the penultimate lap, coming in loose and high to turn 2, leaving an opening for the surging number 87 to attempt to pass. The two cars come within inches of contact as they accelerate into the straightaway. Will holds them off, barely. Pacing at the fence, Nancy pulls a fresh cigarette from a red fanny pack. She remembers the wreck at Rome that retired her son, Will's father. That nightmare recedes as her grandson takes the checkered flag. He won, he won. Back in the pits, Will removes his helmet and climbs out of the car, stepping over the glittering decal for Rowland Tire, the family business back in Jasper that is his birthright should his NASCAR dreams fail to materialize. He needs to tell his dad that the track is getting slick and that they might want to attach the spoiler to the car before the next race. but not before getting a congratulatory kiss from his biggest fan. That's pretty tight.
That is great.
Really well written.
So the five, the way that John Franklin, Pulitzer Prize winning uh, journalist, talks about outlines is he says just about every story can be told in 5 points. And he says he's not interested in outlining the beginning, the middle, and the ending, but he's more interested in outlining the end of 5 sections. So basically, what are the 5 big transition points, or the 4 big transition points? And then what's the resolution? So, we talk about a case study, a testimonial video, or like a testimony, if you're going to do like a story for a church or whatever, is basically who were they before? What problem did they experience? What was the solution? What's the result? What's the future look like? So that shows us kind of what sections need to happen, but that's still not interesting. What's interesting is Ryan and Amy and I just finished a story, Jana, that was about a church that got firebombed. Like, once again, what's the most interesting thing about that story? They got firebombed. And yet, our first draft, because we weren't sure where it fit, didn't even include the firebomb, because we were trying to fill in the 5 sections of the story. But one of the big points, one of the big transitional moments in the ministry is they got firebombed. So what's interesting about this? The firebomb. So I think that one of the big questions to ask about this is what's interesting about this story? Because if it were me, I'd go, a kid is riding in a race car and he wins. Cool, big deal. So what are the 5 big transitional moments in here? And usually Franklin would say the first transitional moment is where you speed into action. Like we start off, setting the scene. Where do we speed into action? So that's going to be point number 1. Point number 2 is probably the section before point number 2 is going to include background information. And then at the end of it, it's going to give us a small turn. Point number 3 is going to be a big turn and probably a larger conflict. Point number 4 is we're going to get some level of resolution. And then 5 is going to be how we close the whole story. The distance between 4 and 5 is very short. So once we hit point 4, which is it's the battle scene, like once Luke Skywalker kills Darth Vader, like those final couple scenes are hugging and shaking hands and patting each other on the back and bye. If it goes too much longer, we're gonna bore the heck out of people. So those are the 5 points. So I'm going to start again, and I want to stop me when you think we're at a transition moment, and maybe what we can name this transition moment. So in the pit, 73-year-old Nancy Rowland, poker visor down and a Marlboro light dangling from her lips, pushes an ice scraper across the hood of the race car, sweeping off chunks of orange clay. 13-year-old Will Rowland steps out from behind the trailer, zipping up his black and red fire suit. He slips on his helmet and climbs behind the wheel of the number 22, right?
I was waiting to. I was trying to
Climb-
time the end of your sentence.
Rowland, when he climbs in, he climbs into the car.
Yes, slipping on the helmet, climb behind the wheel.
I
I
think it's-
feel like is where it starts to turn. It's not the biggest. It's not the biggest ramp into action, but it's the first ramp into action.
I think that's
it's the-
interesting.
Before, I think it's the 13-year-old Will Rowland steps out from behind the trailer, zipping up his black and red fire suit, because I'm like, why is this 13-year-old wearing a black and red fire suit, and what is he going to do with that? And
That's
then,
interesting.
yeah, that's where I started being like, what's happening? Because he starts with 73-year-old Nancy Rowland, and I'm like, why is this old lady doing this? And then I'm like, 13-year-old, what is this? What's this child doing here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I think that's intentional, because I think it makes you just be like, wait, what's happening? And then and then your next sentence, slips on his helmet and climbs behind the wheel. I think it might be the same turn, but I think that's where I feel it the most.
That's interesting. So that's not what I thought the first point is, but I'm totally convinced by your argument. I thought that wheel to wheel, hub to hub, doorpost to doorpost, here we go. The race starts.
It's the first you're saying?
I thought that was the first. I thought the first waited that long, but I see what you're saying, because then we've got you're right. We've got he gets in his car and roars to life.
Hmm.
I think all of that sort of together, that's
Mhm.
the first. So basically, he starts his engine. So we
Yep.
could say, and John Franklin would say, if you can do noun, action, verb, noun as your point. So maybe we could say this is um, Will starts engine. And then where do you think the next point is? If we say Will starts engine is point number one, because then you're right. We go into some background information.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the first ramp into action is the car is that those couple lines describing the car. So don't know what the suit's for. Oh, he slips on a helmet behind the wheel. Okay, now we're talking about a car. Oh, then you talk about 400 horsepower. Okay, now it's clear. So that's where it's the first transition, I think, into action. We do get into a little bit of background here, but there's action in you can visualize Will's father leaning over and talking to this car that's currently turned on.
Mhm.
Um, and then you go into a little bit of the background, but yeah, like the tension's building. I feel the engine's running right now. We're not racing yet, but the engine's running and stuff's
Yeah.
happening around it. And then I would say two is kind of where you said where you're thinking one was initially is where the race starts. That's
Yeah.
kind of the next transition into the because I'm still a little confused on like the numbering, but that's when it's I think starts the section three, the middle section, like the big, not necessarily thinking about the classic like rising action climax falling, not necessarily
Yeah,
that
yeah,
structure.
yeah, yeah.
But this is where I think most of the action is happening in this third section, and that's where it starts for me.
Yeah. Will starts race. So we've
Mhm.
got Will starts car, Will speeds off or
Go
something.
peels out.
And then where would you say the next big turn in the story is?
I would say, well, maybe that's too early. I was gonna say it was when it's like the penultimate lap, so that second to last lap for me is when he starts to come up short, feels like a distinctly different set of action from the race.
Yeah. And Will holds him off
Yep,
barely.
yep. And then you've got another visual of Nancy kind of stressing out, smoking. Totally get it. Thinking about her son's crash. So some more background, but it's all happening within that penultimate lap kind of moment.
Yeah.
And then the next, not to jump ahead, but then I think this section ends when we find out what actually happens in the last lap.
He won.
Yeah. So it's like Will starts engine, Will speeds off, Will falls behind, maybe,
Uh-huh.
and then Will wins race.
Yeah.
It's kind of 4 in my mind.
And then we close it up with
Family celebrates legacy. That seems like a big
family celebrates legacy. Yeah.
that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
It's just really well done because he's giving you all of this background information that makes you care a lot about what's going on, like in the action. Like I feel like if this was just written from a purely like this is what happens and this is what happens, I mean, it wouldn't be well written. I mean, it could be well written that way too, but I care because of all this background information that he's giving us. Like if it was just like a story like a 13-year-old drives a car with some older guys and he wins, that's great. Like it might be well written, but the reason that I think it's powerful is because you're talking about his family. You're talking about that line about like he steps over the decal, the family business back in Jasper. That's his birthright. Should his NASCAR dreams fail to materialize? Like that's huge. Like I'm like, oh wow, like that's really interesting. Like it's just like information that he pairs along with his action like very seamlessly, and I think that brings a lot of the emotion to the story that otherwise I don't think I would care about it. And so I think I'm almost like, in my perspective, the emotional family driven details are almost like the biggest turns for me because I care more about that than I care about, this one race. Like I care about the fact that like Nancy's thinking about her son who like had to retire. And then I even like when you're talking in the first turn, like even when his dad is like leaning over the car to like talk to him, and then he sends him out into this this giant oval with men twice his age. Like I'm like, oh, that's an emotional interaction, like even though it seems very like trivial. So I think like it's almost like there's two like interwoven like outlines. There's like the emotional background outline, and then there's like the actual action outline of what's happening in the story.
Yeah, you would think the firebomb, initially, I thought the firebomb in this story was the age of the driver. 13, that seems pretty young. But I actually think the firebomb in the story, what actually makes this interesting is the generational story of racers that you learn about throughout and by the end.
Yeah, the
So
history.
it explains the youthfulness, which was initially maybe the false hook. Look how young this kid is, but really the hook is his grandma is in his crew because his dad has been racing his whole life and his passes on him. So the firebomb is actually the connection between the crewmates that is kind of revealed throughout, given the background information in my mind.
Yeah. No, that is fascinating. Yeah, this is dangerous. He's young. I like the circular form here. We start with 73-year-old Nancy Rowland and we end with congratulatory kiss from his biggest fan. So we've got Nancy bookending the whole thing.
It's great.
So I really liked how you guys ended up outlining that. I think it's better than, oh, maybe I did say, here's what I wrote. Maybe I did think of it that way now that I look at it again. I have Will starts engine, Will begins race, 87 challenges Will. Will wins race, Nancy celebrates Will. So here's something that we have to do a lot of that I think is kind of boring, which is introducing a brand. I mean, it's not really boring, but it could be very boring. So I did this brand reveal video script, and this is how I outlined it. And then Kirk, Jason, and I are doing a much longer talk, revealing the brand. So brand seeks opportunity, history limits brand, brand expands services, brand expands audience, brand reintroduces itself. So the people that I'm talking to here are really interested in uh, they're really interested in their brand because, you know, it's how they're making their living, it's their life's work. So I don't know if that was the strongest opening thing, but the idea is the what comes before this is we say, you guys are awesome, you've done all these things, but it's kind of limited you. There's more for you, and then here are the ways that you're sort of limited by how you're presenting yourself right now. But when we really dig into what you do all these things that are so much bigger than you've ever communicated before. And because of that, you're able to serve so many other people than you ever have before. Therefore, here's your new brand messaging. And now, boom, here's who you are. And they hopefully will applaud and say, woo, yes.
That's so good.
So I'm curious. This is an article that Erica's working on right now. I kind of wanted to hear her talk through it. But I'm just kind of curious what you guys are working on. Um, and this could be as simple as an email, but that you could see outlining in this way. And then how would you approach it if you had to start outlining like this?
Yeah, so one of the new things I'm working on that you two have worked on before this, so you may have some insight, is fundraising messaging. So, and I'm trying to figure out, I feel like one of the reasons fundraising messaging is really hard for a brand or a person or a church or a client, whoever, is because they really, they're coming at it in a place of need. So they obviously need something from whom they're asking. But they only have so much time and attention to make their need genuinely interesting to the person that they're asking. So I've started to draft some things, and I've just run into myself droning on for this client of just talking about all the stuff we want to do, but not necessarily making it interesting for whom they're talking to. And so I could see this kind of outlining being really helpful in keeping the call to action keeping the whole thing tight and keeping the call to action at the end something that the audience wants to do because the story is interesting enough to them to invest in themselves. So that's one area I think I could see this type of outlining really helping me right now.
I would love to talk through that, because there's an existing form, and next month Jan is going to talk about core stories, but there's an existing form that you just sort of have to fill out. And the form of a fundraiser is, we're doing great work, but there's this need. This is how we are going to fill this need. Basically, my vision of the future world. Here's how we're going to do it and who we're going to do it with. And also kind of like why you can trust us. Call to action. So that's sort of those are almost like the headline sections. But what's really pulls the story forward is how each of those sections are going to transition.
Mhm.
So the first section actually ends at the need that we're facing because, once again, that first section is we're awesome. You can totally trust us. We're awesome. Here are all the cool things we've done. But it kind of ends with a but,
Mhm.
which is not a BUTT, children, a BUT. Um, it reminds me of something else that I'll say later. What is that first turn in the story that says all is not well here? And how can we put it into action terms? And usually, I think the temptation for a lot of fundraising is, but we don't have enough money.
Mhm.
That is not very interesting to most people. The question is,
What's the money?
what's that?
What's the money going to do in order to get us where we want to be?
Yeah, I think a lot of uh, here's a tricky. I think maybe Jana, you worked on something like this. It was like a retire the debt thing.
Yeah,
Like we want, man, that's not very inspiring. But if you say we've got this beautiful property, we've got, we've been able to do all these things with it.
and talking about what you're going to get to do when the debt is retired and the
Yeah,
other.
what is the problem? The problem cannot be that, so that first turn cannot be, but man, we're sick of paying mortgage. What is that first turn?
That's good.
Jana, do you remember how you turned that story?
I think it was just talking about, it was very community based. And so it was talking about the impact that they could have on their community if they were able to invest more in their community by building a very specific like community building type of situation. And then talking specifically about the community they were trying to reach that they were uniquely positioned to reach, but not yet reaching because they didn't have an in that community. And so this retiring the debt would also allow them to start investing in this next endeavor that they had to specifically reach a very specific community that they were fully capable of reaching if they could start investing in a specific aspect of this community. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, church owns building, but that first point should be an action that
true.
turns us and pulls us into action. So what would get us into the action would have to be about it could almost be like it could be about the community needing Jesus or the community needing so much more than we can offer. And I don't have a
Yeah,
good
okay.
action statement there.
It might be I think I remember what you were talking about. So some of this might be retconning that unnecessarily, but I'm just trying to come up with something more compelling at the turn than we need money. And like, there was a couple that came to mind, like for this particular, like again, just eliminating the debt on the space, the value under eliminating the debt on the space, or the problem, I guess, that we're trying to resolve is dollars stop here for me sounds like, so yeah, so establishing the probably at the front saying like community needs us, Jesus, investment, care, whatever you want to put there. but our dollars stop here on the thing we have because this is expensive. So if we can eliminate this problem, then then we can we can redirect those resources to what the community needs. It's like one of the ideas that I was kind of aiming at there.
Amy right now is working on a project that is community community resource center that's like, you know, food and then connect you to local services and then a bunch of other things. So it's kind of like to write a fundraising pitch for that, it would be she had like a statistic like 33,000 people in our area are still living at the edge of poverty. So it could be something around that. And then the next point would really paint the problem that and it would get you to how can we help? And then the third section would be here's our plan. If we have this much money, we're going to do these things.
Mm.
The fourth section then becomes, or at the end of the fourth becomes, here's what it looks like when it's done. And then the end of the fifth section is call to action. So what I would probably end up doing, and what I did when I outlined that brand video, is I wrote that 5-point outline several times in a row. Like I want to end in these five ways. And then I was just sort of backfilling, like if I want to end here, I know we need to say this stuff before it. I was just kind of putting general bullet points. We've got to cover this information before we hit this turn, this turn, this turn. And then when I actually wrote it, I started with the last section because that's the easiest thing to write. So I sort of went last section, sort of middle section to end, and then first section to the end. And then the last thing that we did was write, how are we going to start this? And I think it would have been really hard to know to start with the 73-year-old woman if we didn't end with the 73-year-old woman giving him a kiss. So that's sort of like, if you know what your call to action is, you almost can say for sure what your first sentence is going to be.
Definitely.
Comments?
It's great. It's writing in reverse so that there's no, in my experience, I don't waste any more. The time I waste the most amount of time is when I write without knowing where I'm going, and then I realize where I ended up is not where I wanted to end up. Now you've got to go back and trailblaze where you want to go. So if the outlining process helps you determine the end, and then determine the transition points of getting to the end, so that you start in the right place and you end in the right place. I think that's the biggest value of outlining in my mind. And I think it's a win. Like, so going back to your example, family celebrates legacy is kind of the interesting way to talk about the fifth and final beat. And that's where if you can, I feel like if you can name your fifth part of your outline with the interesting firebomb, then your whole thing's going to be great, because now the ending actually has some oomph and impact because you're revealing finally.
Yeah. That's a much better way to say. I will say that, like, writing that outline might require, my brother-in-law and I talk about this all the time. There's like a bottom-up process and a top-down process. The bottom-up being, like, sometimes you just do have to free write or think or talk about it with somebody else. What's the story going to be? And then you can come back and say, okay, now I'm going to line this out. So it's almost like you have to go up, you have to go
Mhm.
down, you have to re-outline it once you've written a little and you're like, I don't know if this is really working anymore. So it's like, I think one of the things that we get sold when we're younger is that outlining will, you outline it and then you write it and then you're done. Like plan the whole thing. Why are you wasting time? Writing is just an exercise in wasting time. I don't know if there's another way to do it besides trying this, going back. But I do find generally making those initial outlines speed you up a lot.
Mhm.
And then seeing agreement. So that's good.
Agreed.
All right. So next month, Jan is talking about core stories, and that has a very strong and definite outline. All right. May our words bring people close to the kingdom. May our minds be filled with beautiful words. May our tongues, keyboards, pens, and pencils flow with words that draw people to God. Amen.